tonight we continue our study in the book of Ruth, and we're going to finish chapter 1, focusing in on verses 17 through 22. There are 4 acts in the book of Ruth. They correspond to the 4 chapters, and we've called Act 1, Death and Emptiness. And by the time we get through verse 22 tonight, both death and emptiness will be mentioned several times. So that really is kind of the theme of this first act. We've looked at 3 different scenes. We've looked at 2 of them. We'll add the third one tonight. And scene 1 is the trip from Bethlehem to Moab. And this is the scene that the narrator tells us about. Elimelech and Naomi leave the land of Israel and go to Moab because there's a famine in Israel. Life is okay in Moab. There's food. Things are going great until Elimelech dies. And then Naomi's 2 sons get married to Moabite women. And then the 2 sons, 10 years later, pass away. And so by the time we get to verse 5, the only people left in the story is Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. All the men in the story have passed away. So this begins in scene 1 as a tragedy, especially for Naomi, especially back in the ancient world, where women relied upon men for protection, also for provision. And here is poor Naomi. She has no husband, she has no sons, she has no grandsons. All she has left in her life are 2 foreign women who used to be married to her sons. So that's how verse 5 ends. Scene number 2 is the return from Moab to Bethlehem. And after Naomi's sons die, she decides she's going back home. Because now she's a foreign woman living in Moab. She has no husband, she has no sons, no one to look after her or protect her. So she decides she's better off if she returns to the land of Israel, to the town of Bethlehem where she's from. So now she's trying to convince her 2 daughters-in-law that it would be better for them if they stayed in Moab. I mean, they're Moabite women, their families are in Moab, the chances of finding another husband are greater in Moab than in Israel, so why don't you just stay in Moab? And in this scene, there's 3 conversations. Conversation number 1, Naomi addresses Orpah and Ruth and tells them to stay in Moab. And in verse 9, they weep, they wail, and it looks like Orpah and Ruth are going back home. But in verse 10, surprise, surprise, Orpah and Ruth both say to Naomi, we're staying with you. So conversation number 1 for Naomi ends in failure. She didn't convince anybody of anything. But she's not about to give up. So she tries again to persuade the 2 daughters-in-law to return to Moab, their families, stay there. And in verses 11 through 14, finally there's a decision. And Orpah looks at her mother-in-law and says, you're right. Life would be better for me if I stayed in Moab. So I'm going to go home to my parents, and hopefully Dad can arrange another marriage for me, or something can happen in my life where I can find another husband and start life all over again. So Orpah leaves the scene. And if this was a play, she would walk off stage and never return again. So we have no idea what happens to her. She's out of the story by the time we get to verse 14. But as Orpah is leaving, Ruth is clinging, perhaps physically clinging to Naomi and saying to her, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying with you. Well, Naomi's going to try a third time in verses 15 through 18 to try to convince Ruth to stay in Moab. It would be better for you to stay in Moab. And so in verse 15, this is her final speech. This is her last opportunity to say to Ruth, leave, go home, enjoy life here in Moab. So she says to Ruth, look, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. You know, it's like Orpah has walked off, and Naomi says to Ruth, there goes your sister-in-law. And she's going back home. If you run, you can catch up with her. And you can go back home too. Because life would be better for you in Moab than if you stay with me and go to the land of Israel. And then in verses 16 and 17, Ruth will make her decision. And for the first time in the book, she talks. She's going to give a speech. And it's the most memorable speech in the entire book. And it's incredibly persuasive. And we looked at the first part of this last week. Ruth replies, don't urge me, or really, stop urging me to leave you and turn back from you. It's like Ruth says, I've heard this, I've heard this, I've heard this. And yes, Naomi, you're really convincing, but I don't want to hear it anymore. So quit trying to convince me to go back, to leave you. Now, it's interesting that the word return, which is the most popular word and most prominent word in this entire act, is used this time not to turn back to a place, but to turn back from a person. And Ruth basically says, I don't want to turn back from you. Ruth says, Naomi, if I leave you now, it'll be like I'm abandoning you. And I'm not going to do that. So quit trying to convince me to leave. And then Ruth says some very quotable words that have been quoted many times since then. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Well, Naomi's on her way back to Israel, to the tribe of Judah, to the town of Bethlehem. And Ruth is saying, okay, I'll go with you. I've never been to the land of Israel. I have no idea where Bethlehem is. I don't know if it's a good place or a bad place, but if that's where you're going, that's where I'm going. And wherever you live, and by the way, where are you going to live when you get back there? But wherever it is, I'm going to live with you. And then she says, your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Obviously, Naomi's people are the people of Israel. And the big question is, will the people of Israel, will they accept Ruth, a Moabite? She's not an Israelite. She's a Moabite. Will they accept her? She doesn't know. And then, my God, obviously, Naomi's God is Yahweh, the God of Israel. And Ruth doesn't even know if Yahweh will accept her. But she's going back with Naomi. And then she continues in verse 17, and that's where we pick up tonight. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Now, in the ancient world, it mattered where you got buried. Number one, it mattered if you received a burial. Because if you were an honorable person, then you deserved an appropriate burial. And that meant something to the ancient people. Also, where you got buried meant a lot to the ancient people. In fact, the only place that Abraham buys in the Promised Land is a cave to bury Sarah, his wife. And once she's buried there, well, the rest of the family wanted to be buried there as well. So, today we may not care at all where we get buried. If we get buried, cremated, we don't care. Our soul's going to leave the body and go be with Jesus. And when Jesus returns, we get a new body anyway. So we may not care, but they did. And the idea is you want to be buried with your family. That's an honorable thing to do. But Ruth is saying, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Now, Ruth is from Moab. She should have said, and when I die, make sure somebody takes my body back to my family and places it in the family grave back in Moab. But she doesn't say that. She says, I'm willing to be buried in a foreign land because I am staying with you. I'm not leaving you. And that's where I will end my life. And then, Ruth is going to take an oath. She's going to make an oath of allegiance, a pledge of loyalty to Naomi. And that's what she does in the last part of verse 17. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. In fact, Ruth says, death won't separate us. Because wherever you're buried, I want to be buried right beside you. It's like I'm now part of your family, and I want to be buried in your family tomb. Because that's what I want to do. So she takes an oath of allegiance. And it's interesting that she takes this oath, and she calls on the God of Naomi as the one who witnesses the oath. Now, if you take an oath in the ancient world, you have to have witnesses. And if you really want to get serious, you will ask divine beings to be the witnesses to your oath. In other words, you would ask God to be the witness to your oath. And that's what she does. But it's interesting about which God she chooses. She chooses Naomi's God. Now, she knew the god of Moab. She grew up knowing all about the god of Moab. His name is Chemosh. But she doesn't take this oath in the name of Chemosh. She takes the oath in the name of the Lord, which, by the way, when you see Lord with all capital letters, that's Yahweh. So she takes this oath in the name of Yahweh, the God of Israel. Now, it was interesting back in the ancient world that the ancients thought that there was a God over every territory. And of course, the God over Israel would have been Yahweh. The God over Moab would have been Chemosh. And since Ruth is moving to Israel, she calls upon that God to witness her oath. Which at this point, how much does she know about the God of Israel? We really don't know. I'm sure Naomi has said a few things about the God of Israel, but how much does Ruth really know? But she's willing to take this oath in the name of Naomi's God that she's going to remain loyal to Naomi even to the point of death, and then she's going to be buried right beside her. An incredible oath. And then she says, be it ever so severely. And this is what you include in an oath, basically saying, if I'm unfaithful to this promise, this pledge, may God, in this case Yahweh, deal with me however He wants to deal with me. You know, may He punish me in whatever way He feels appropriate if I do not keep my promise to you, Naomi. And Naomi hears all of this. And Ruth's speech is done. And I don't know all of what Naomi said, but Ruth's speech, that's really persuasive. In fact, it's so persuasive that Naomi says, I can't top that one. So in verse 18, when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. In other words, she stopped pleading with her to stay in Moab. So Ruth gives the best, most persuasive speech of the two. And Naomi simply concedes. There's nothing else she can do. Ruth is determined to go with me, and it doesn't matter what I say. I can talk till I'm blue in the face. She's not going to change her mind. So come on, Ruth. Let's go to Bethlehem. Now, there's something that the text does not tell us. Is Naomi happy that Ruth is coming with her? Or is Naomi thinking, so I'm going back to Bethlehem, to my old friends, and I've got to explain my horrible life to them. And not only do I have to explain my horrible life, I've got to explain this Moabite girl that I have with me as well. So is she happy or not so happy about Ruth going with her? And we are really not told how she feels at this point. We only know that Ruth was more persuasive than Naomi, and Ruth is going to Bethlehem. And that sets up the final scene, which I've called the lament of Naomi. Naomi and Ruth will arrive safely in Bethlehem. So for Naomi, she's back home. For Ruth, she's looking around going, this is Israel. First time here, taking in the sights. And the word return will be repeated again in verses 21 and 22. That's the predominant word in Act 1. Naomi will return, and Ruth will return with her. But this is not going to be a happy homecoming. Sometimes when you go back and you visit with relatives, it's a great time. You're so glad to see them. They're so glad to see you. And it's just a great celebration of being back together again. But Naomi knows when she reaches Bethlehem, looks at the old sights, sees some of her old friends. It's been 10 years, maybe longer. All of those sights will remind her of her husband and her boys. And they've passed away. And her friends, how will they receive her now that this has happened to her? Will they have pity on her? Will they accept her? Will they have compassion on her? She doesn't know. But she does know that when she left Bethlehem, things were really good, except for the famine. But now that she's come back, she's pretty much lost everything. And now she's bitter. In fact, she doesn't even want to be called Naomi anymore. She says, I'm not that same person. I need to change my name. She vents to the town people. And it's kind of interesting because, up to this point, Naomi has hinted at how she feels. But once she gets around her friend, she just spills her guts. She doesn't hold back. She just lets everything loose. It's kind of like today, when somebody asks you, how are you? You go, oh, fine, or, I'm doing the best I can, making the best of a bad situation. I'm hanging in there, struggling through. But when you get with some friends, you can just let them know how you feel. You don't have to hold back because they're your friends. And that's what Naomi's going to do. And it looks like by the time we get to the end of this chapter, the end of Act 1, it appears that using modern terminology, Naomi is clinically depressed. She's in bad shape. And obviously back in the ancient world, she couldn't go see a psychiatrist because they didn't have those back then. But she certainly needed to see somebody who could help her because she is literally at the end of herself. That's where we find Naomi at the end of this chapter. So let's look at what happens. It says, so the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. The narrator says the two women. Obviously, it's Naomi and Ruth. Started out with three women, but two will finish the journey. Orpah has left. She's going back with her family. Now, if Naomi had it her way, maybe it would have been only her who returns to Bethlehem. But the author reminds us that Ruth is still there. It's also interesting, the author says, the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. What's missing? The men. There are no men left in this story. It's just the two women. So the author gives us a bit of a clue that this may not turn out so well. It's just the two women. Men are absent. When they arrived in Bethlehem, so they make it there, but we also don't know a lot about the journey. We don't really know where in Moab Naomi and Ruth were staying. We don't know what part of Moab that was. We really don't know where they lived. We really don't know how they made their money, especially how Elimelech and the two boys had taken care of the women while they were still alive. We're not told any of that. We're not told how they got there. Chances are they walked, but did they have enough money that they actually owned animals and rode animals? Maybe a donkey from Moab to Bethlehem? We're not told. How long did it take? It was 75 miles. In the ancient world, if you hustled, you could do that in 3 days. But did they hustle? Did it take them 4 days, 5 days? Did it take them a week? How long did it take them to make the journey? We really don't know. And what was Naomi's mood? It's like, come on, Ruth. Was that a happy come on, or was that a, come on, Ruth, you got to go with me? Was she sad about that, or upset about that, or frustrated about that? And then it's 75 miles, and it's two women. They had to have talked about something. What did they talk about? Or did they barely talk at all? We really don't know. The author really doesn't say. But then, when they arrive in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. Now remember, this is the little town of Bethlehem. We sing that during Christmas, but Bethlehem has always been a little town. Not a lot of people. And so two strangers show up, and the whole town gets stirred. The whole town, men and women both, although we find out it's harvest time. So chances are most of the men, the able-bodied men, are out in the fields, either starting the harvest or getting ready for the harvest to begin. So chances are Naomi shows up back in town, and she goes back to some of the places where her women friends used to hang out. So she goes back there. And then it says they were stirred. And the Hebrew word can mean hum, murmur, roar, or buzz. It could be positive or it could be negative. It can mean to bring into unrest or confusion, or it can mean to resound with excitement. So Naomi shows up, and are these women stirred up because they're confused? It's like, why is she back in town? Or are they so excited to see her? We really don't know. And scholars debate back and forth about whether this was stirred up because they were delighted to see her, or stirred up because they looked at her and said, what happened to you? Now, part of it is Naomi shows up. And what does she look like? How is she dressed? She's lived 10 years in Moab. Is she dressed like a Moabite? Did she take on the customs of the Moabites, and is she dressed more like a Moabite than an Israelite? Maybe. And whatever she's wearing, is it new? Or is it ragged and torn? She's lost her husband, she's lost her sons. Has she also lost her wealth, or did they have some money before the men died? We don't know. The expression on her face, what does that communicate? Her mood, what does that communicate? And also her age. It's been 10 years. So, if we see somebody 10 years from now, they're not going to look exactly the same. Now, Naomi's been through a lot the last 10 years. Does she look like she's aged 10 years, or does she look like she's aged 20 years? And we're not sure. So, they could be delighted to see her. It's a surprise. It's a celebration. And they say, can this be Naomi? They could be saying, could this be Naomi? Wow, this is so great. Naomi's come back. We're so happy. Or are they looking around at Naomi thinking, can this be Naomi? What in the world has happened to her? Last time I saw her, she was doing great. Oh, she doesn't look so good anymore. So we're really not sure how they're stirred up. They're either confused or they're celebrating, and we really don't know. However, beginning in verse 20, we do know how Naomi is feeling. Naomi is now with her friends. Naomi has perhaps been stuffing her emotions, because who is she going to tell in the land of Moab what's going on, and will they even care? But these are people she's known for many years, and she hasn't seen them in 10 years, but they're still her friends. And she's going to let them know how she feels, what she's thinking. "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. Well, the word Naomi means pleasant. And back in the ancient world, names meant something. More than just identifying a person. It says something about your character. It can say something about your personality. It can say something about what your mother went through in giving birth to you. Sometimes children were named based upon that. But maybe Naomi's mother had told her, "You're so pleasant, and life is going to be so good to you. I have named you Pleasant because God's going to bless you." And so Naomi knows what her name means. But she says, "Don't call me that anymore. I have nothing to be pleasant about. My husband has died. My 2 boys have died. I have no grandchildren. I have no one to take care of me. I have no one to protect me. I have lost everything. So don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara." And the word Mara means bitter. Call me bitter. I'm a bitter old woman. That's who I am. That's what life has done to me. It has turned me into a bitter old woman. So don't call me Pleasant anymore. I'm changing my name to Mara. I am bitter. Now, it's interesting that whoever wrote the book of Ruth doesn't play along. She's still Naomi the rest of the book. And probably her friends don't play along either. They're not going to call her Mara. They'll continue to call her Naomi. But now we kind of get a feeling of how Naomi thinks about herself, thinks about life, thinks about her circumstances. She's a bitter old woman. And perhaps at this point she feels shame for what's happened to her. She's empty. No husband, no sons, no grandsons, no money. Got nothing. Her reputation. I'm sure that before she left, she would go down to the meat market, or she would go to the well, or she would go where the women hang out, and she would tell stories about her husband and about her 2 sons. And she had a reputation of being pleasant. And she was blessed. And she was happy. But not anymore. She can't tell those stories anymore. And not only that, she's upset with herself. She's devalued in her own eyes. In the ancient world, a woman's self-worth came from having a husband and having sons to carry on the family name. Now, it used to be that Naomi could say, "I have a wonderful husband. He takes care of me, he provides for me, and not only did I give him 1 son, I gave him 2 sons. But now she has no husband and no sons. And her self-worth has hit rock bottom. Her purpose in life, Naomi says, "I'm too old for another husband, and I'm past the days of being able to bear children. I've lost my purpose." She also feels she may be devalued by the other women. Now, nobody in this story is going to say anything to her negatively, but she may be thinking, if I go to the well and draw water, The other women are going to look around. Oh, she lost her husband. She lost her sons. She's got nothing. What did she do to deserve what happened to her? Did she make God angry? What sin did she commit that God did this to her? Kind of like when Job's friends show up. Job, buddy, you just experienced tragedy after tragedy. You must have done something really, really bad. So confess up. Job said, I didn't do anything. Same thing with Naomi. What did you do to deserve this? I didn't do anything. And she feels hopeless. For her, there seems to be no way out of the pit. There's no way this story turns out positively. She's going to be a bitter old woman till the day she dies. Well, the depth of her bitterness and emptiness gets expressed by her giving 4 accusations, 4 laments. And interestingly enough, they're all directed at God. So who's she going to blame for all of this? Herself? Her husband? Her kids? Nope. God gets the blame. In fact, these 4 laments, which I summarize here, are in a pattern, interesting pattern. There's a pattern that's very common among literary writers. It's called the A-B-B-A pattern, where the 2 A's refer to the same thing. They're mentioned first and they're mentioned last, and then the 2 B's are in the middle. There's 2 different names or titles for God that she knows. One is Shaddai, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. So, Shaddai has made me bitter. Not that life has made me bitter or my own bad decisions have made me bitter. Nope. God made me bitter. Shaddai has made me bitter. And then there's 2 statements where she refers to Yahweh. Yahweh brought me back empty. Brought me back here, and I've got nothing. And then Yahweh has either testified against me or has afflicted me. And we'll take a look at that Hebrew verb. And then finally, Shaddai has brought misfortune into my life. So this is a lament against God. She's going to blame God for what has happened to her. So it begins in the last part of verse 20, where she says, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. And Shaddai, the Hebrew Shaddai, in English gets translated the Almighty. Shaddai deals with power. He's the ultimate power in the universe. God has all power. And Naomi says, the God who has all power has made me bitter. And if God has all power, ultimate power, who am I to stand against Him? Who is anybody to stand against Him? So it's interesting that Shaddai is the word for God known to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember, Yahweh was not introduced until Moses. When Moses said, what's your name? And God said, I am who I am. So the name Yahweh was not even introduced until the time of Moses. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob knew God as Shaddai, the all-powerful God of the universe. So Naomi says that Shaddai, who used to bless me, has now made me bitter. He gave me a husband, He gave me sons, He gave me property, He gave me possessions, and He's taken it all away. Shaddai has made me bitter. And not only that, I don't have a grandson to carry on the family name. And I can't have another husband, I'm too old. And I can't have any more children, too old for that too. So in other words, I'm done. And I'm bitter because of it. The divine ruler of the universe has made me bitter. And she's not done, because she's got 3 more Well, actually, Job. Wouldn't it be interesting if Job and Naomi could have a conversation and just kind of swap stories? It's interesting what Job says. As surely as God lives, who has denied me justice. That's what Job said. God has been unfair to me. Same thing Naomi's saying. God has been unfair to me. I didn't do anything to deserve this. God has been unfair to me. In fact, Job wants to take God to court and sue him because God has done wrong, injustice toward him. But then it's interesting what Job goes on to say. The Almighty, Shaddai, same word, who has made my life bitter. Same thing. It's interesting in the Hebrew Bible, not the English Bible, but the Hebrew Bible, Ruth gets placed with Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastics, and Job. There are some similarities in those stories. So both Job and Naomi lose their children. And they become bitter. And they accuse God of unfairness. Interesting. Well, moving on to verse 21. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back. That's that idea of return again. He brought me back empty. So Naomi says, I left Bethlehem with a husband and 2 sons. I had a wonderful family. Things were great. I felt blessed. But here I am 10 years later coming back to Bethlehem. I'm empty. No husband, no children, no nothing. And not only that, but it's the Lord. And again, that's Yahweh, all capital letters, Lord, who has brought me back empty. God didn't bless me. God's brought me back empty. It's interesting at this point that Naomi doesn't mention Ruth. I mean, it would have been appropriate for her to say, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty, except for the fact that the Lord has shown some grace to me. I do have my daughter-in-law with me. But she doesn't say that. She doesn't even mention Ruth. Why? Maybe she doesn't want to draw attention to the fact that her daughter-in-law is a Moabite. Maybe she just can't deal with that right now. Or it could be that there's so much grief and self-pity that Naomi can't see the positive. Ever been there? I mean, things are so bad, so negative, you can't see the positive. You can't see how this could possibly turn out better. There's no hope. This is bitterness, emptiness. And it's not going to change. That's where Naomi is. Interesting that Naomi is probably thinking, wow, used to have a wife and 2 wonderful kids. Now I got a Moabite daughter-in-law. That's not a fair exchange. So, why do you call me pleasant? Got nothing to be pleasant about. Well, the third accusation, the Lord has afflicted me. And that's how the NIV translates it now. Another way to translate that Hebrew verb is the Lord has testified against me. So depending upon what translation you have, it may say that the Lord has testified against me. And the picture is the courtroom. And God brings all these accusations against Naomi. The only problem with that theory, the author never gives us an accusation. There's no wrong listed in the story that Naomi did. And that's why a lot of scholars now think, and maybe it's not that at all, maybe it's just the fact the Lord has afflicted me, taken away everything that I used to have and enjoy. Then there's the final lament. The Almighty, back to Shaddai, has brought misfortune upon me. Shaddai has brought disaster upon me. He has brought distress upon me. That's quite a mouthful in 2 verses. Here's an interesting thought. A lament, a complaint against God. Is it really a form or an expression of faith? Because here's the deal. If a person has no faith, and they think God did all of those things to them, their conclusion might be, well, if that's how God's going to treat me, then I want nothing to do with Him ever again. This is what God did to me, so I am done with God. And Naomi could have said, okay, Yahweh Shaddai, we're done. From now on, I'm worshiping Baal. You know, I'm going to change gods. I'm going to take my chances with Baal because of the way you've treated me. And there are people today who think, you know, God allowed this horrible thing to happen in my life, whatever it was, and because of that, I want nothing to do with God. And they wash their hands of God, and they spend the rest of their life paying no attention to God. They basically erase God from their life. That's a person without faith. And there are thousands and thousands of people in this country and around the world who have done just that. You know, if this is what God allowed in my life, so I want nothing to do with God ever again. In fact, a lot of the atheists, a lot of the people who are angry at church, there's a story behind their anger. And their story is God let something happen that was tragic. And because of that, I want nothing to do with Him ever again. But if you're a person of faith, you don't have that option. It's like, God allowed this. I'm angry with God, but He's still God. And there's no one who's God other than Him. So I have to deal with Him. And yes, I still believe in Him. And yes, I still want to be loyal to Him. And yes, I still want to live for Him, but I'm angry at Him. And you have to wrestle with that reality. Could that be where Naomi is? I'm angry with God. I'm frustrated with God. I feel God's given me a bad deal, but He's still God, and I'm still going to follow Him, and I'm still going to trust Him, even though I'm not happy with Him. And maybe you've been there a few times. Something happened, and why, God, did you allow that to happen? This isn't fair. This isn't right. But you let it happen. But you're God, and you're sovereign. You're in control, so I have to deal with it. I have to live with it. But it's frustrating. It's where Naomi is. And this expression of lament, in many ways, is Naomi saying, I'm having trouble with God right now, but He's still God, and I'm still going to follow Him. Also, Naomi gives us 3 wrong ways to handle problems. You know, when tragedy hits, when difficulty hits, when we have a problem, there are 3 ways not to deal with it. And the first one is to withdraw. You know, Naomi, when she's around her friends, you know, is trying to put them at a distance. Yeah, she's in many ways complaining to them. She's lamenting to them, but at the same time, she's kind of putting them at a distance. And the wrong way to deal with tragedy and difficulty and problems is to put other people at a distance. It's the person who isolates who's the most vulnerable to do something tragic to themselves. You need somebody to talk to. You need somebody that you can be a Naomi with and just let it all out. You can't withdraw. The second thing Naomi does, she attacks herself, which Naomi's thinking, okay, if I attack myself, then these other women can't say nasty things about me or make accusations about me. So I'm just going to do it for them. So don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. So I'm not the same person. So in many ways, she attacks herself. But the problem with attacking yourself is that you're in this bubble and you can see nothing but negative. And you can see no solution to your problems if you do that. Then the third thing she does, she attacks others. She finds somebody to blame. And in this case, God is the one to blame. But if you're blaming God, then you can't really solve the problem. So those are three ways not to solve a problem. And it's interesting that Naomi is guilty of doing all three. Well, Act 1 concludes in verse 22. And that's the end of Naomi's lament at the end of verse 21. But there's one more verse written by the author. And the author says, so Naomi returned. His favorite word is again. In fact, in the Hebrew, it's Naomi returned and Ruth returned. But the NIV, instead of doing a run-on sentence, shortened it to Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite. It's interesting that in this chapter, in Hebrew, the word returned is used 12 times. In English, it's used 10 times. It's the key word in the entire chapter. So, Naomi returns from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite. So the author lets us know, okay, Naomi didn't say a thing to her friends about Ruth. But the author lets us know she's still there. She's standing there. She's not going anywhere. The story's going to include Ruth as well. It's also interesting that it's Ruth the Moabite. 6 times in this book, Ruth is called Ruth the Moabite. Kind of reminds me of the book of Esther, Mordecai the Jew. You know, there's probably 10 times in the book of Esther that Mordecai is called Mordecai the Jew. Well, this is Ruth the Moabite. And it's also interesting now that they've arrived in Bethlehem, and this very grim, this very dire chapter that's been about tragedy and lament, and, you know, this has just not been a happy chapter at all. But it will end with a word of hope. And the word of hope is the barley harvest was beginning. Chapter 1 begins with a famine and Naomi's family leaving the land of Israel. Chapter 1 ends with a harvest, and Naomi has returned to Bethlehem. The barley harvest is in late April, early May. It's the first of the grains to be harvested during the year. They return to Bethlehem, which Bethlehem is mentioned. Bethlehem is the house of bread. You know, back in the first part of this chapter, the house of bread had a famine. Now the house of bread is going to have a barley harvest. There's going to be grain. There's going to be bread. There's hope. And maybe there's hope for Naomi and Ruth as well. So Act 1 ends. And we're thinking, that was depressing. But there's hope. There's a barley harvest. Maybe that one thing can change everything. And sometimes in our own life, when we're depressed about something, all we see is problems. Maybe there's that one ray of hope. And maybe that one small thing can turn everything around. We'll find out next week when we get into chapter 2 and Act 2 of the book of Ruth. Heavenly Father, thank you for this story. It's a story that all of us encounter at one time or another when things don't go as planned, when things don't go the way we want them to go, and we have to try to make sense out of life, and we have no real way of doing that. So, Father, I just pray that what we learn from Naomi, what we learn from Job, can help us during those times of lament, during those times of frustration, during those times when we just feel like life has turned against us. So, Father, increase our faith, grow our faith, help us to be strong, even when we're really weak. And help us to look to you, even though we may not be happy with you at the moment. I pray all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen.